Every night at 11 p.m., the Imperial Japanese Navy ran a bus service straight into a shooting gallery. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express, and for 6 months in 1942, the water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island became the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth. To understand why the Japanese Navy was running freight by warship, we have to go back to August 1942, when American Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal. That island in the Solomon Chain sat squarely across Japan's supply line to the south, and both sides knew whoever held its airfield controlled the region. The Japanese had been building an airfield on Guadalcanal, and when the Americans seized it mid-construction, they renamed it Henderson Field. That airfield was the key to the whole campaign, and the Japanese High Command knew they had to retake it or starve their own forward position. But there was a problem. American aircraft from Henderson Field dominated the daylight sky, so Japanese supply ships could not sail by day without being sunk. So the Japanese did what any navy with a supply problem and no air cover would do. They switched to night operations. They stripped destroyers of their heavy torpedoes and loaded them with drums of food and ammunition instead, turning warships into freighters. These drums were dropped overboard near the coast to be pulled ashore by the garrison or by small boats, a crude but workable system. The route ran through the channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, a narrow passage the sailors called the slot. The Americans, watching these nightly runs from Henderson Field, gave them a mocking nickname, the Tokyo Express. Each run was a race against dawn, because a destroyer caught in daylight by the Cactus Air Force rarely survived the trip home. The Cactus Air Force was the motley collection of American aircraft based at Henderson Field, named for the island's code name, Cactus. By day they pounded the Express, and by night they could only listen and wait, because night bombing was nearly impossible with their gear. So the night belonged to the Japanese Navy, which had drilled its crews relentlessly in night combat and night navigation. That skill had been honed for years, and it was about to turn the slot into a graveyard of ships and a legend of night warfare. The man who built the Tokyo Express into a weapon was a Vice Admiral named Guinea Mikawa. In August 1942, Mikawa had already stunned the Allies by sinking 4 heavy cruisers in one night at Savo Island. That victory gave the Japanese a brief window of naval supremacy around Guadalcanal that they used to reinforce the island. But the American carrier forces were still dangerous, and Mikawa knew he could not hold the sea by day. So the Tokyo Express settled into a grim routine that ran almost every night from August to November 1942. A typical run took a handful of fast destroyers down the slot at 30 knots, hugging the coast to stay under radar. Each destroyer carried hundreds of sealed drums lashed to its deck, each drum packed with rice, ammunition, or medicine. Reaching the drop point, the crews heaved the drums overboard, and the garrison hauled them in with small boats. It was crude, but it worked, and for weeks it kept the Japanese garrison fed while the Americans could not stop it. The problem was that the Americans were learning the rhythm, and they began to send their own warships to meet the Express. The result was a series of savage night battles in the slot, fought at point-blank range in the dark. Neither side's radar was reliable in those early months, so crews fought by searchlight, star shell, and instinct. The Japanese had drilled for years in night gunnery, and their long-range torpedoes gave them a brutal edge. Those torpedoes were the Type 93, a weapon so advanced the Allies nicknamed it the Long Lance. It carried a warhead of nearly 1,000 pounds and could run for miles, far beyond what American skippers expected. Time and again, American crews never saw the long lance coming until it tore into their hulls. The long lance turned every night battle into a one-sided lottery, and American skippers learned to fear the dark. Yet even with that edge, the Express could not solve the garrison's deeper problem because the drums never carried enough. A destroyer could carry only a fraction of what a cargo ship could, and the garrison was burning through supplies fast. By October 1942, the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal was down to a single meal a day, and some men were eating bark. The Americans on the other side of the airfield were not much better off, and both armies were fighting a war of hunger. So in mid-October, the Japanese decided to gamble everything on one massive supply convoy, escorted by the whole fleet. On the night of October 13th, Japanese battleships bombarded Henderson Field with 14-inch shells for over an hour. The bombardment wrecked dozens of American aircraft on the ground and tore up the runway that was the island's lifeline. With the airfield silenced, the Japanese convoy slipped through the slot that night and unloaded its precious cargo. It was the one time the Express ran by day unimpeded, and it delivered enough to feed the garrison for weeks. But the Americans rebuilt the runway in days, and the Cactus Air Force rose again to close the slot. By November, both sides were exhausted, and the nightly rhythm of the Express was about to break into open fleet battle. The Japanese High Command was convinced that one more big push would crush the Marines, and they planned a decisive landing. That landing force would sail down the slot on November 12th, directly into a trap the Americans were setting. What followed was the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a desperate slugfest in the dark that decided the campaign. It was a battle fought at pistol range, where gunners fired into the silhouettes of enemy hulls barely a few hundred yards away. The First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was a chaotic melee fought in almost total darkness and at point-blank range. American radar finally worked that night, giving the task force a precious few minutes of warning before the enemy appeared. But the advantage evaporated when American destroyers and cruisers collided in the confusion, breaking their own formation. In the chaos that followed, both fleets hammered each other at ranges under 1,000 yards, trading broadsides in the dark. The American Admiral Daniel Callaghan was killed on the bridge of his flagship during the exchange that night. When daylight came, the sea was littered with wreckage from both sides, and the cost had been staggering for everyone. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, while the Japanese lost 2 battleships and a destroyer of their own. Japan lost 2 battleships in that single night, a blow from which its surface fleet never fully recovered. Yet the strategic result was a draw, because the Japanese troop convoy still slipped through and landed its reinforcements. The Americans had stopped the Japanese battleships, but they had not stopped the men and supplies getting through. So the Tokyo Express kept running, and the nightly race between supply and starvation ground on into December. By then, the Japanese garrison was so short of food that some units were surviving on grass and roots. Malnutrition and disease were killing more Japanese soldiers than American bullets ever did on that island. The Japanese High Command finally accepted the truth in December and ordered a secret evacuation of the entire garrison. The evacuation had to be disguised as a reinforcement, so the Navy ran the Express one final time in reverse. In early February 1943, the last of the Japanese garrison was lifted off Guadalcanal under the Americans' noses. The evacuation of 11,000 Japanese soldiers was carried out in 3 separate runs in early February 1943. Each night the destroyers slipped in, loaded their men, and vanished before the American aircraft could find them at dawn. The Americans had no idea the Japanese were leaving, because every sign pointed to a fresh reinforcement landing. On the night of February 7th, the final run lifted off the last of the garrison, completing the evacuation without a single loss. The very next morning, American patrols pushed into the abandoned Japanese positions and found the trenches empty. The Japanese had pulled off one of the most successful evacuations in naval history, right under the noses of the Americans. Guadalcanal was finally secured, and the Allies declared the campaign over on February 9, 1943. But the Tokyo Express did not simply disappear, because the Japanese rebuilt the same tactic for every island to the north. The lessons of the slot were carried into the Central Pacific, where night combat became a specialty of the American fleet. American radar had matured in the crucible of Guadalcanal, and it would soon give them a decisive edge in every night action. The Japanese, by contrast, never solved the radar problem, and their own night fighting edge eroded with every passing month. The human cost of the 6-month campaign was staggering on both sides, with tens of thousands of casualties in total. Most of the Japanese losses came not from combat, but from starvation and disease in the jungle. Historians often call Guadalcanal the turning point of the Pacific War, and the Tokyo Express was its strangest signature. It marked the first time in the war that Japan lost a campaign on land, and its fleet never recovered the initiative. The nightly runs that began as a desperate stopgap had become the symbol of a strategy that could no longer be sustained. Yet the story of the Tokyo Express did not end with the final evacuation in February 1943. The same night-running destroyer tactics were transplanted northward to the waters around New Georgia and Columbangara. By mid-1943, the Japanese were running the Express into the Central Solomons to feed a garrison at Munda Airfield. But the Americans had learned the Express's habits, and they built a counterweight called the Cactus Air Force's night patrols. The decisive counter came in March 1943, when radar-equipped American aircraft ambushed a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. In that single engagement, American and Australian aircraft sank the 8 transports and 4 of their escorting destroyers. Roughly 3,500 Japanese troops were aboard those transports, and nearly all of them were lost. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that the Tokyo Express could be beaten in daylight, provided the aircraft could find it. After that disaster, the Japanese abandoned large troop convoys and returned to the small, fast destroyer runs of the original Express. The Express ran its last true supply missions in the Central Solomons during the summer of 1943. By September, the Americans had isolated the remaining garrisons, and the nightly runs became too costly to continue. What had begun as a brilliant improvisation at Guadalcanal had become a predictable, losing habit for the Japanese fleet. The deeper lesson of the Tokyo Express was about the mathematics of attrition, which the Japanese could never win. Every destroyer the Japanese committed to the slot was a warship that could not fight in the decisive battle they were saving for. By late 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost so many destroyers that its escort forces were critically weakened. That shortage would haunt the Japanese in every later campaign, from the Marianas to the Philippines and beyond. The pattern that would define the rest of the Pacific War was now set, and it began with a shortage of destroyers. In the first 2 years of the war, Japan built only a handful of new destroyers, while losing dozens in the Solomons. The American shipbuilding program, by contrast, was producing destroyers faster than the Japanese could sink them. This was the industrial arithmetic of the Pacific, and it meant every night battle favored the side that could replace its losses. Yet before the industrial balance could tell, the Japanese still had one more card to play in the Central Solomons. That card was the destroyer transport, a hybrid warship that could sprint at 30 knots and still carry troops. Throughout the summer of 1943, these fast ships kept feeding the garrison at Munda Airfield on New Georgia. But the Americans had built a new weapon specifically to hunt the Express, and it changed the game completely. That weapon was the radar-equipped night bomber, which could find and strike the Express when it was most vulnerable. The Japanese destroyers had no radar of their own, so they could not see the bombers coming until the bombs were falling. By late September of 1943, the nightly runs into the Central Solomons had become too dangerous to continue. The remaining Japanese garrisons were left to wither, cut off from resupply by the very tactic that once sustained them. The Tokyo Express had been a brilliant tactical idea, but it was never a strategic answer to a losing war. Every ton of fuel the Express burned was a ton the Japanese fleet could not spend where it truly mattered. And those destroyers, worn down by night runs, would be desperately needed when the American fleet came to the Marianas. But before that decisive showdown, the Japanese would try one more variation of the Express in the waters off New Guinea. In late 1943, the Japanese attempted to reinforce their garrisons along the northern coast of New Guinea with night destroyer runs. But by now, the Americans had radar-equipped patrol craft and night fighters patrolling those same waters every evening. The New Guinea Express never achieved the success of its Solomon's predecessor because the element of surprise was gone. American night tactics had matured from improvised scrambles into a coordinated radar-directed system of interception. A destroyer that could no longer hide in the dark had lost its greatest advantage in the Pacific War. By the end of 1943, the Japanese had effectively abandoned the offensive use of the Express altogether. The campaign that had begun as a desperate improvisation ended as a costly lesson in the limits of naval logistics. Historians now count the Express among the most remarkable small-unit naval operations of the entire Pacific War. Yet its true significance lies not in what it achieved, but in what it cost the Japanese fleet over 18 months. In that period, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost dozens of destroyers in the Solomons and New Guinea campaigns. Each of those ships carried trained crews that Japan's wartime shipyards could never fully replace. The Americans, by contrast, were commissioning new destroyers faster than the enemy could sink the old ones. That industrial asymmetry was the quiet arithmetic that decided the Pacific War long before the final battles. So when the American fleet finally steamed into the Marianas in June of 1944, the Japanese were short of escorts. The destroyers that might have screened the Japanese carriers had been spent, one night at a time, in the slot. The Tokyo Express did not lose the Pacific War on its own, but it quietly spent the escorts Japan could not spare. And yet the full measure of the Express is best seen in the numbers that both navies quietly kept. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the Japanese ran roughly 130 destroyer sorties down the slot. Those runs delivered roughly 20,000 troops and hundreds of tons of supplies to the starving garrison. But the cost of that lifeline was staggering, with at least 22 Japanese destroyers lost in the campaign. The Americans, by comparison, lost roughly 24 warships of all types in the same waters. The difference was that the United States could replace its losses in months, while Japan could not replace its destroyers at all. This was the cruel mathematics of attrition, where winning the battle could still mean losing the war. Yet the Express left behind more than sunken hulls, for it also shaped how the American fleet fought for the rest of the war. American destroyer crews who survived the slot became the most experienced night fighters in the entire Navy. Their hard-won radar tactics were written into doctrine and carried into every later Pacific campaign. By the time of the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, American night fighting had become a science. There, an American battle line crossed the Japanese forces' path with radar-directed fire that the enemy could not match. The lesson of the slot had been carried forward, and the Japanese never regained the night. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Express had been a brilliant improvisation born of a strategic miscalculation. It kept a doomed garrison alive for months, but it spent the escorts that might have protected the carrier fleet. And that is the deeper truth of the Tokyo Express, a tactical marvel that quietly mortgaged Japan's future at sea. To see how deeply that mortgage ran, we need to follow one ship on a single night's run. The destroyer Amagiri was a veteran of the Express, having run the slot many times since the campaign began. On the night of October the 7th, 1942, Amagiri was part of a force sent to bombard Henderson Field. Her mission was to fire high-explosive shells at the American airfield and then escape before daylight. But American radar picked up the approaching force, and a column of torpedo boats moved out to meet it. In the chaos that followed, Amagiri collided with the American torpedo boat PT-109. The destroyer's steel bow sliced clean through the wooden torpedo boat, splitting it in two. Two of the boat's crew were lost in the collision, but the rest survived in the water. The survivors swam for hours toward a nearby island, carrying one badly injured crewman among them. That injured officer was a young lieutenant junior grade named John F. Kennedy. Kennedy led his men to safety and later carved a message into a coconut shell for a rescue party to find. The rescue succeeded, and the story of PT-109 became one of the most famous episodes of the whole Pacific War. But the deeper lesson of that night is how the Express kept forcing chance encounters along the slot. Every run carried the risk of collision, ambush, or radar-guided gunfire in the blackness. And the Amagiri herself was not finished, for she survived the war only to be sunk by a mine in 1944. Her end came near Makassar Strait in the Dutch East Indies, a long way from the slot she had once ruled. But before the night of October 7th, Amagiri had survived many runs, and her story helps explain how the Express actually worked. A typical Express run began in the late afternoon at the Japanese anchorage in the Shortland Islands. There the destroyers loaded troops and supplies, often in sealed drums meant to be thrown overboard near the beach. The ships would then steam southeast down the slot, timing their arrival off Guadalcanal for the darkest hours. The voyage of roughly 170 miles took most of the night and had to be timed with precision. American aircraft ruled the daylight hours, so the entire operation had to be compressed into the few hours of darkness. To reach the beach, the destroyers had to slip past Savo Island, a volcanic cone that guarded the northern entrance. That narrow passage had already claimed American and Australian cruisers in a devastating ambush back in August. Once past Savo, the destroyers turned toward Cape Esperance and the beaches held by the Japanese garrison. The troops and supplies were put ashore quickly, sometimes in under an hour, before the ships turned for home. But a fast turnaround was not enough, for the return leg was just as dangerous as the approach. American destroyers and aircraft would strike at the retiring column as dawn broke over the slot. This is why the Japanese preferred high-speed destroyers, which could outrun the slower American cruisers. A Japanese destroyer could make roughly 35 knots, faster than almost anything the Americans could bring to bear. But speed was a double-edged sword, because it forced the destroyers to burn fuel they could barely spare. Japan's oil reserves were already stretched thin, and every express run consumed fuel that could never be replaced. So the Japanese developed a desperate workaround, hauling fuel in ordinary drums lashed to the decks of their destroyers. These drums were meant to be rolled overboard and retrieved by the soldiers waiting on the beach. But on many nights, the retrieval failed, and precious fuel sank uselessly into the black water. This was the brutal arithmetic of the Express, where every ton delivered was paid for in risk and loss. Yet the Japanese kept running the Express because the alternative was abandoning their garrison entirely. The garrison on Guadalcanal was fighting not only the Marines, but also starvation and disease. Malaria and dysentery took a terrible toll on men who could barely get enough food to stay strong. In this way, the Express became a lifeline that kept the Japanese army fighting long after it should have withdrawn. But the Americans were not passive spectators, for they built their own weapon to break the nightly runs. That weapon was radar, which let American ships see the Express long before the Japanese saw them. Japanese commanders were slow to trust radar, and this hesitation cost them dearly in the night battles. American destroyers could now fire accurately in the dark, turning the Express into a shooting gallery. The nightly rhythm of the slot now became a contest of technology against sheer audacity. Each side tried to outguess the other, and the slot became a chessboard played out in pitch blackness. And the cost of every mistake was measured in ships sent to the bottom and crews never coming home. Yet the Japanese pressed on, for their commanders believed no amount of loss could justify abandoning the island. By November 1942, the Tokyo Express had grown into a full-scale logistical operation, moving entire regiments at a time. On the night of November 13th, a Japanese force of 2 battleships bombarded Henderson Field with 14-inch shells. The bombardment destroyed dozens of American aircraft on the ground, but it did not knock out the airfield itself. The American response was a desperate night surface action that would become known as the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. In that chaotic clash, both sides battered each other at point-blank range in waters barely wider than a river. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, but they turned the Japanese battleships away before they could finish the airfield. The next night, the Japanese returned with a battleship and a heavy cruiser to try once more. But American radar and aircraft caught them, and that battleship, the Kirishima, was sunk in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The loss of the Kirishima marked a turning point, for Japan could no longer risk its big ships in the slot. From that point on, the Express reverted to destroyers alone, carrying supplies in ever smaller and riskier runs. By late November, American destroyers were lying in ambush along the slot, waiting for the next Express to appear. On the night of November 30th, they caught a column of 8 Japanese destroyers off Tassafaronga Point. The Battle of Tassafaronga became a painful lesson, for the Japanese launched their torpedoes before the Americans even opened fire. The American force lost 1 heavy cruiser and had 3 more badly damaged, all to a single well-aimed torpedo volley. Even in defeat, the Japanese destroyers escaped, proving that the Express could still sting harder than it was hit. By December, the garrison on Guadalcanal was starving, and even the Express could no longer bring enough rice to feed them. By December of 1942, the garrison on Guadalcanal was starving, and even the Express could no longer bring enough rice to feed them. The Japanese High Command finally accepted the hard truth that the island could not be held. In late December, they made the decision to evacuate rather than sacrifice the entire garrison. But the army refused at first, insisting the island could still be reinforced and retaken. The Imperial Army and Navy had long argued over strategy, and this evacuation was no exception. It took the personal intervention of the Emperor himself to break the deadlock and order the withdrawal. This was a rare and significant step, for the Emperor almost never involved himself in operational decisions. And so the Tokyo Express was given one final mission, the most demanding of them all, a full evacuation. In late January and early February of 1943, the Express ran its most delicate operation of the war. The Navy called the evacuation Operation Key, and it had to be kept completely secret from the Americans. If the Americans discovered the evacuation, they could pour in reinforcements and crush the departing troops. To mask the evacuation, the Japanese launched a series of diversionary actions to confuse American intelligence. They also reinforced the island with fresh troops, making it appear they intended to fight on rather than flee. The evacuation was carried out in 3 nightly waves, each one timed to the moon and the weather. American commanders remained convinced the enemy was reinforcing, not withdrawing, and so held back their fleet. It was a masterful deception, for the Express evacuated over 11,000 troops right under American noses. And yet, even as the last of the destroyers slipped away, the campaign was not quite over. On the night of February 7, 1943, the final wave lifted the last of the garrison from the beach. In total, Operation Key extracted nearly 11,000 troops from an island the enemy believed was being reinforced. The Americans did not realize the island was empty until their patrols walked ashore and found the silence. It was one of the most successful large-scale evacuations of the entire Pacific War. With Guadalcanal finally secured, the Allies had won the first strategic offensive of the Pacific War. But the cost of that victory was staggering on both sides of the island. The United States lost 24 ships and well over 1,000 aircraft in the 6-month campaign. The Imperial Japanese Navy, for its part, lost nearly twice as many warships in the same waters. The waters around the island became so littered with wrecks that sailors called it Iron Bottom Sound. That name endures to this day, a permanent marker of how brutal the nightly race had become. The Tokyo Express itself did not vanish with the evacuation, for it lived on under other names. The same nightly destroyer runs were later used to supply Japanese garrisons across the Solomon chain. But the lesson of Guadalcanal was now clear, that night runs could no longer feed a starving army. The real turning point of the Pacific War had been reached, and Japan's offensive momentum was broken for good. From Guadalcanal onward, the Allies would go on the offensive, island by island, all the way to Japan itself. The struggle for Guadalcanal would go down in history as the first great Allied counteroffensive of the Pacific War. Its lessons would reshape how both navies fought for the rest of the war at sea. The destroyer had proven itself the workhorse of the night, and every navy now built around it. American radar technology, still crude in 1942, would improve rapidly in the months that followed. The Japanese, who had once owned the night, would never regain their mastery of it. The Tokyo Express also taught the Allies that logistics, not glory, won wars in the Pacific. Every future campaign would be planned around the simple question of how to feed the men who fought. And the campaign proved that air power could turn any remote island into a decisive battlefield. Henderson Field, the prize the whole campaign turned on, became the model for every island airfield to come. In the wider Pacific strategy, Guadalcanal marked the hinge between defense and offense for the Allies. General Douglas MacArthur's drive through New Guinea and Admiral Nimitz's island hopping both flowed from this victory. The nightly race in the slot had bought the Allies time, and time was now on their side. American shipyards were launching new warships faster than Japan could ever hope to replace its losses. The industrial might of the United States was now the decisive force in the Pacific War. Japan could keep the Night Express running, but it could not keep building the ships to run it. And so the Tokyo Express, born of desperation, became the symbol of a navy running out of time. For the men who served in those waters, the memory of the nightly race never truly faded. Veterans on both sides would later describe the slot as a place where time itself seemed to slow down. The nightly bombardments, the radar blips, the sudden flares, all of it became a routine that no man could truly get used to. In the decades since, historians have sifted through the archives to count the true cost of the Express. Records from the United States Navy show that the Japanese destroyer force lost more than 30 ships in the campaign. Those destroyers were the heart of the Japanese fleet, and losing them gutted the Navy's striking power. The Tokyo Express had consumed the very ships it needed to survive, a paradox that doomed the whole strategy. Yet the Express also left a lasting mark on American naval thinking for decades to come. The destroyer, once seen as a disposable escort, was now understood as the decisive weapon of the night war. American night fighting tactics, born in the slot, would be refined and taught to every new crew. The lessons of Guadalcanal would echo through every subsequent campaign across the Central Pacific. At Tarawa, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, the same hard question of supply and survival would return again. But by then, the balance had shifted, and the Allies held the initiative that Guadalcanal had won for them. The island campaign, so desperate in its dark months, had become the foundation of final victory. Every sailor who crossed those waters understood they were part of something far larger than one island. And the story of the Tokyo Express would endure as a lesson in what desperation can achieve and what it costs. Historians still debate whether the Express was a triumph of improvisation or a fatal miscalculation. What is beyond dispute is that the Express bought Japan months of time it could not otherwise afford. Yet every ton of supplies delivered by destroyer came at a price the fleet could not keep paying. By late 1942, the Express was running on a schedule that read more like a suicide roster. The Imperial Navy's own records acknowledge that destroyer crews were being asked to fight a war they could not win. Still, the Express kept running because the alternative, abandoning Guadalcanal entirely, was politically unthinkable. And so the drain continued through the autumn, each night eroding the fleet a little further. The American side understood the trade and chose to match the Japanese destroyer for destroyer. Yet the arithmetic favored the Americans, whose shipyards could replace losses measured in weeks, not years. That single industrial fact, more than any battle, decided the fate of the Tokyo Express. By the time the Express finally ended in February 1943, the Japanese had evacuated the island's garrison. In a final irony, the evacuation itself was carried out by the same destroyers that had run the supply line. The Express that had been built to feed a garrison ended by silently carrying that garrison away. Historians at the United States Naval War College still teach the Express as a case study in unsustainable strategy. Its lesson is that a brilliant tactical solution cannot survive a strategic problem it was never designed to solve. And that is the deeper truth of the Tokyo Express, a nightly miracle that could never become a lasting victory. The final evacuation, called Operation Key, was completed in early February of 1943. In a series of 3-night runs, the destroyers carried more than 11,000 soldiers off the island. The Americans, unaware of the scale of the withdrawal, did not move to stop it. So the very destroyers that had fed the garrison now carried its last men home in silence. Guadalcanal was now firmly in American hands, and the airfield that had started it all was secure. The campaign had cost both navies dearly, with losses that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. But Japan could not replace its destroyers, while America's shipyards were just beginning to surge. That industrial gap, more than any single battle, decided the outcome of the entire campaign. The Tokyo Express stands today as the clearest example of a tactical masterpiece built on a strategic trap. It bought Japan time it could not afford and spent the ships it could never replace. And that is the sober lesson of the Tokyo Express, a nightly miracle that could never become a lasting victory.